Anne couldn't believe it. After years of late nights, endless coffee, and sacrifices that blurred her weekends into workdays, she was finally stepping into her dream job at Crane & Associates, the kind of firm where ambition wore designer suits and every smile had an agenda. The lobby alone smelled like success, polished marble, sharp perfume, and the faint hum of power in the air. Her heart raced as she adjusted her blazer, hoping no one could see how nervous she was inside. This was supposed to be her moment, the beginning of something great. Richard Crane, her new boss, had that kind of presence that made people straighten their posture without realizing it. His charm was disarming, but his eyes, they measured everything. Anne had heard stories about him, a man who could make or break a career with a single email. Yet when he shook her hand and smiled, something in her told her to be careful. It wasn't fear exactly, more like instinct whispering, "Don't get too close." Still, the offer was too good to question. Within weeks, Richard called her into his glass-walled office, sunlight glinting off the awards on his shelf. "Anne," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "you've impressed me. I want you to lead our next campaign, a promotion, just like that. No warning, no build-up." She smiled, thanked him, and walked out stunned. Why her? Why now? The question lingered, faint but persistent, like a shadow following her every step. The next morning, Anne arrived early. Too early, actually. The office still carried the quiet hum of machines warming up and the faint scent of someone's forgotten takeout. She liked these moments, the calm before the chaos, but even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Richard's praise had felt too deliberate, too rehearsed. Promotions didn't happen like that. Not in her world. It was almost as if he'd been waiting for her to step into that office. By noon, her inbox was overflowing with messages from departments she didn't even know existed, all congratulating her. "You must have made quite the impression," Mia joked, handing her a coffee. Mia was the kind of friend who saw through everything, loyal, sharp, and unfiltered. But when Anne mentioned the sudden promotion, Mia's smile faltered. "Just keep your guard up, okay? Richard doesn't do generosity without strings." Her tone was light, but her eyes said more than her words ever could. Anne tried to laugh it off, to convince herself Mia was overreacting. Maybe this was finally her big break, and she deserved to enjoy it. Still, a quiet unease settled over her shoulders like a weight she couldn't shake. Every time Richard passed her desk, his presence filled the air. Too close. Too confident. He didn't have to say a word. Somehow she already knew. This was only the beginning, and whatever came next would test her in ways she wasn't ready to admit. Days turned into weeks, and Anne's life began to blur into a rhythm of meetings, presentations, and polite applause. Outwardly, she was thriving, confident, precise, the rising star everyone admired. But beneath that polished surface, something inside her was tightening. Richard's attention became more pointed. He'd linger after meetings, his compliments landing just a little too close, his questions dipping a little too personal. "You have potential, Anne," he'd say, his tone laced with something that made her skin prickle. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. Maybe he was just intense. Maybe this was how powerful men operated. But every time she walked into his office, that same unease crept in, the way his gaze lingered, how his words seemed to have layers. And when he started calling her into late-night meetings, just the two of them under the hum of fluorescent lights, she began to realize this promotion might not be the reward she thought it was. It felt like a test she hadn't agreed to take. One evening, as the city lights flickered through the glass walls, Richard smiled and said, "You're not like the others, Anne. I can tell." His words should have sounded like praise, but they carried something else, a quiet warning, maybe even a claim. As she gathered her things, her hands trembled slightly, though she hid it well. Somewhere deep down, she knew the line between opportunity and manipulation was about to blur, and once crossed, it would change everything. Anne used to love the sound of her phone buzzing. It meant progress, excitement, connection. Now, it only made her stomach twist. Richard's messages came at all hours. Short, sharp, impossible to ignore. "Need you in my office? Urgent. Join me for a late review. Don't be late." At first, she told herself it was part of the job, the price of success. But soon, those meetings bled into her nights, her weekends, her sense of self. Every buzz of her phone was another thread tightening around her freedom. The office, once her playground of ideas and ambition, began to feel like a cage. Richard's tone changed, subtle at first, compliments that cut too close to her personal life. a hand on her shoulder that lingered just a moment too long. "You and I work better alone," he'd say with that smooth, knowing smile. She'd nod, pretending not to notice the chill in her veins. Inside, a quiet panic grew, pressing against the walls of her chest. She was losing the version of herself she'd fought so hard to build. Mia noticed the change before Anne admitted it. "You're not sleeping," she said one morning, handing Anne a coffee that smelled like comfort and concern. Anne tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "Just work stress." Mia didn't buy it. "Richard's pushing you too far. That's what he does. Makes people think they owe him." Her words hit like a mirror, reflecting what Anne already knew but couldn't say out loud, because saying it meant naming the truth, and the truth was starting to feel dangerous. The late-night meetings became routine, each one stretching longer than the last. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence between Richard's questions, his words carefully measured, almost intimate. "You're special, Anne," he'd say, leaning just close enough for her to feel his presence. "You understand how things work here." The implication was clear. Loyalty wasn't just about performance anymore. It was about compliance. And every time she nodded, pretending not to understand, she felt a small piece of herself slip away. At home, Anne tried to compartmentalize, to separate who she was in that glass office from the woman who once loved her job. But even her apartment felt colder now, her reflection in the mirror carrying a stranger's exhaustion. She replayed Richard's words in her head, dissecting every tone, every pause. Was this mentorship or manipulation? The question clawed at her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't remove. Her confidence, once her armor, was beginning to crack. Mia urged her to document everything. "If something feels wrong, it probably is," she said, her voice low, steady. "Don't give him the chance to twist it." But Anne hesitated. Reporting Richard could mean the end of her career, and maybe worse. He had power, influence, and a way of making people doubt themselves. Still, somewhere inside her, a spark remained, small, flickering but stubbornly alive, a whisper reminding her she wasn't powerless. Not yet. Richard's control tightened in quiet, calculated ways. He'd assign impossible deadlines, then offer help that came with invisible conditions. The line between guidance and dominance blurred so smoothly, it almost looked like mentorship from the outside. To everyone else, Anne was thriving, the boss's favorite, the rising star. But behind that polished image was exhaustion, fear, and a growing sense that she was being pulled into a game where she didn't know the rules. One evening, after another draining meeting that ended in Richard's lingering gaze and that unspoken threat of expectation, Anne sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name: anger, shame, or maybe both. She had always believed in hard work, in fairness, in earning her place. But now, she saw how easily power could twist virtue into vulnerability, and that realization scared her more than anything. The next day, she walked into the office with a new kind of silence, the heavy kind that comes before a storm. Richard smiled when he saw her, confident as ever, but she no longer looked at him the same way. Somewhere deep in her gut, suspicion began to form, faint at first, then sharper. Something told her this wasn't just about her. There was something bigger beneath the surface, and soon enough, she'd find proof of it. It started with a glitch, small, almost invisible. Anne was working late again, sifting through campaign budgets on Richard's shared drive, when a mislabeled folder caught her eye. Archived reports, 2018. Not her department, not her business. But curiosity has a way of whispering louder when you're tired and desperate for something to make sense. She clicked. Inside were emails, spreadsheets, contracts, and one file that froze her in place. Private transactions. Crane. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Names, numbers, offshore accounts. It didn't read like a report. It read like a cover-up. She scrolled faster, scanning lines that shouldn't exist. Bribes disguised as consulting fees. Project bids manipulated from the inside. The further she went, the colder she felt. This was corruption, plain and simple, and Richard's name was everywhere. Suddenly, the promotion, the late meetings, the manipulation, it all connected like pieces of a puzzle she wished she'd never seen. She leaned back in her chair, breath shallow, mind racing. Should she tell someone? Close the file? Pretend she'd never opened it? But before she could decide, she noticed something else. Her own name, buried deep in a thread of emails, labeled as one of the trusted contributors. Panic gripped her chest. He was setting her up, or worse, already had. The realization sent a chill straight through her bones. Whatever game Richard was playing, she was no longer just a pawn. She was evidence. The office felt different the next morning. Brighter somehow, but colder too. Every sound was sharper. The hum of the lights, the rhythmic clack of keyboards, the faint ring of phones. Anne could barely focus. Every face around her looked like it might already know what she'd discovered. When Richard passed by, she flinched before she could stop herself. He smiled. That same polished, effortless grin, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of awareness. Like he could sense she'd seen something she shouldn't. She tried to act normal, burying herself in reports that suddenly meant nothing. Her thoughts raced through worst-case scenarios. What if he tracked her access? What if he already knew she'd opened the file? Her palms were slick with sweat, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to run, but where? He owned the system, the company, the narrative. Any wrong move, and she'd look like the traitor, not him. And that, she realized, was exactly how he planned it. At lunch, Mia found her sitting in the courtyard, staring at a sandwich she hadn't touched. "You look pale," Mia said softly, sitting beside her. Anne hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Mia, if you found something big, what would you do?" Her friend studied her face, then whispered, "I'd be careful. People like Richard, they don't lose quietly." The warning hung in the air, heavy and real. Anne didn't respond, but in that moment, she knew silence wouldn't protect her anymore. It would bury her. That night, Anne couldn't sleep. The city outside her window pulsed with life, car lights streaking across the street, sirens echoing in the distance, but all she could hear was the echo of Richard's voice in her head. "You're special, Anne." Now those words felt like chains. She turned on her laptop again, her fingers trembling as she reopened the file. Every number, every signature screamed proof, but it also screamed danger. If she exposed him, he'd destroy her first. He'd done it before. She started piecing together a timeline, saving copies to an encrypted drive she didn't even know she'd need until now. The logical part of her brain clicked into gear, cautious, precise, but her chest was tight with dread. She wasn't a whistleblower, she was just someone who wanted to do her job. Yet somehow, she'd become the keeper of something explosive, the kind of truth that could end careers or lives. When Richard's message lit up her phone, "See me first thing tomorrow. Urgent." Her stomach dropped. The timing was too perfect. He knew he had to. She turned off her screen and sat in the dark, feeling her pulse in her throat. Fear pressed hard against her ribs, but beneath it, something else began to stir. Something steadier, sharper. Maybe she couldn't run. Maybe this time she'd have to fight. Anne arrived at the office the next morning with her heart pounding, but her expression calm, almost detached. She'd practiced her face in the mirror, the kind that said, "I'm fine," even when the world was collapsing behind her eyes. When Richard summoned her, his tone was light, almost playful. "You've been busy, haven't you?" he said, motioning for her to sit. Her blood went cold. He knew something. Every instinct told her to deny, deflect, disappear, but instead she smiled. "Always am." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I like initiative," he said slowly, "but I don't like surprises." His voice carried the weight of warning wrapped in charm, that same disarming melody he'd used since day one. She matched his tone, hiding her fear behind steady eyes. "Neither do I," she replied. For the first time, his smile faltered, barely, but enough for her to see the crack in his confidence. That tiny moment of imbalance became her fuel. Back at her desk, Anne's hands trembled, but her mind was already racing ahead. She needed proof, something undeniable, something that couldn't vanish with a single deleted file or whispered threat. That night, she called Mia. "I need your help," she said quietly, voice steady now, "and I need you to trust me." On the other end, Mia didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do." For the first time in weeks, Anne felt something that almost resembled hope. The plan started small. Anne and Mia began gathering fragments, emails, reports, timestamps, anything that looked even slightly off. Every night they met in quiet corners of cafes or in Anne's apartment, their conversations hushed but electric with tension. The glow of the laptop screen became their secret battlefield. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of Richard's corruption, the bribes, the forged deals, the manipulated audits, but the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it all became. Mia was fearless in a way Anne admired. "He thinks he's untouchable," she said one night, scrolling through another set of files. "That's his mistake." Anne smiled faintly, though her chest felt tight. "He's careful. too careful. Still, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of strength, the kind that comes when fear starts turning into anger. She was no longer just reacting. She was planning. For once, she was writing the next move, but danger had a way of finding her. Late one evening, as Anne was leaving the building, she noticed a reflection in the glass door. Richard's car parked across the street, engine running, lights off, watching, waiting. Her pulse spiked. Was it paranoia? Maybe, but she knew better than to assume coincidence. She walked faster, forcing her face to stay calm. That night, she double-checked her locks, then whispered to herself what she needed to believe. You're not the victim anymore. You're the threat. Days bled into nights, and Anne barely slept. The adrenaline that once came from ambition now came from fear, disguised as focus. She and Mia worked in silence most of the time, the air between them thick with urgency. Every new piece of evidence felt like a small victory, but also a countdown. One misstep, and it could all collapse. The more Anne learned about Richard's empire of deceit, the more she realized it wasn't just greed that drove him. It was control, power for its own sake. When the board announced an upcoming audit, Anne saw her chance. We'll give them what they can't ignore, she told Mia, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. They organized the files into an anonymous dossier, a story told in numbers and signatures. Impossible to refute. But it wasn't just about bringing him down anymore. It was about reclaiming the part of herself he'd tried to erase, the confident, idealistic woman who once believed in fairness. She wanted her back. The night before the audit, Anne stood by her window, watching the city lights flicker like restless thoughts. She knew Richard wouldn't go quietly. People like him never did. But she wasn't afraid anymore, not in the same way. Fear had turned into purpose, pain into resolve. Tomorrow would be a reckoning, one way or another. And this time, she'd be the one writing the ending. Morning sunlight spilled through the boardroom windows, cold and unforgiving. The air buzzed with anticipation as the executives gathered, their chatter polite but uneasy. Anne sat at the far end of the table, her pulse steady, her files neatly stacked in front of her. Richard walked in last, confident as ever, his presence swallowing the room. "Let's get started," he said smoothly, as if the world still revolved around him. But today, it didn't, not anymore. When the auditors began their presentation, Anne felt every eye drift her way. Then came the moment, the one she'd replayed in her head for nights. The lead investigator mentioned discrepancies, irregular payments, unexplained transfers. Richard's expression didn't flinch at first, but his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Then Anne spoke, calm, clear. "I believe I can provide clarification," she said, sliding the dossier across the table. Her voice didn't shake. For the first time, he was the one caught off guard. The silence that followed was electric. Richard reached for the papers, his composure cracking just slightly. "Anne," he began, tone sharp, warning, but she met his gaze head-on. "You taught me to be thorough," she said evenly. Around them, whispers rippled through the room. Every page turned was a nail in the coffin of his control. The empire he'd built on intimidation and deceit was beginning to crumble, and Anne was the one holding the match. For a man who thrived on control, Richard's silence spoke volumes. The board members exchanged looks, disbelief first, then anger, then something close to relief. They'd all felt his grip in one way or another, but no one had dared challenge him. Until now. Anne sat still, watching him struggle to find his footing, every excuse falling flat against the evidence laid bare. The charm that once disarmed everyone in the room suddenly looked like desperation. His empire of fear was cracking in real time. The chairwoman cleared her throat, her tone icy but composed. "Mr. Crane, these findings are serious. You'll be suspended pending full investigation." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but no one was listening anymore. The room had shifted, the balance of power no longer his. He looked at Anne one last time, eyes narrowing, rage hidden beneath the surface, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. She simply gathered her notes, stood up, and walked out, her heels clicking like punctuation marks to the end of his reign. Outside the boardroom, Anne leaned against the wall, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. The air felt different, cleaner somehow, like the building itself had exhaled. Mia was waiting near the elevators, a proud smile tugging at her lips. "You did it," she whispered. Anne nodded slowly. "No," she said softly, "we did." But deep inside, She knew the fight had changed her forever. What she'd reclaimed today wasn't just her job, it was her voice. In the weeks that followed, the office transformed. Whispers of the investigation filled every hallway, but this time Anne walked through them with her head high. The fear that once lived inside her had turned into something stronger, resolve. She worked quietly, steadily, no longer needing Richard's approval or anyone else's. People treated her differently now. Not as the favorite or the survivor, but as the woman who stood her ground when it mattered most. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sit by her window and think about everything that had happened. The lies, the manipulation, the quiet moments of courage that no one else had seen. The scars were still there, invisible, but real. Yet beneath them was something new, peace. She'd learned that integrity doesn't come without a cost, but neither does silence. And between the two, she'd chosen the one that set her free. One morning, as she arrived at work, sunlight spilled across her desk. Warm, steady, unfiltered. A new email blinked on her screen. Leadership Summit, keynote speaker invitation. Anne smiled. Not because she needed recognition, but because she'd earned it. The world had tried to test her loyalty, and she'd learned the truth. Real loyalty begins with yourself, and that, finally, was a lesson no one could take away.